Hey you folks, Quilly18 here, and welcome to a brand new tutorial for Unity. This tutorial is going to be a lot smaller and more focused than some of the other ones. I don't like the fact that we sometimes go on long hiatuses in doing a more involved tutorial. So this is going to be a nice compact one that I can do in a day. It'll probably be about 4, maybe 5 parts. We're going to make a 2D space shooter kind of game. It's going to be something a little bit like, I don't know, a little bit like a shmup, or maybe a little bit like an asteroid game or something like that. Basically, I'll set up the basics to it, and you can sort of fill in the blanks and give it the flavor that you want. So a few things right away. Do make sure that if you have any problems, make sure your version of Unity matches mine. I'm currently on version 4.5.5 F1. Newer versions should be fine, but if you have an older version of Unity and you do run into some problems, do update to the same version that I'm using. It'll probably eliminate a lot of issues. I will be using the Pro version of Unity, but everything I will be doing is going to work perfectly fine in the free version, so you should be able to follow along. You don't need to import any packages whatsoever, but I will strongly encourage you to set up your defaults here for 2D. What this will do is it will set up the camera appropriately for a 2D application, including things like projection and whatnot. Set up your scene defaults as well as your file import defaults. Going to be really handy if you set up your defaults to 2D. All right, do keep a note of where you actually set up your project. It doesn't have to be in the same folder as me, doesn't matter. But every now and again I get comments asking like, oh, how do I find my assets folder or whatever? Well, it depends on where you created your project in the first place. So I like to put all my stuff under C/sites because of my old web dev days. All right, I'm going to go ahead and create this project. So this is my screen. This is how I like to lay things out. I'll show you how I lay it out here. If I go up to the layout thing and I choose default, I suppose. There we go. Presumably that's the same default screen you get. Again, the dark colors here is because I've got the Pro version, but that's fine. Everything should work the same. So here's how I like to set up my my particular interface. I really like having my project over on the right-hand side over here. And from the pull-down menu right here, I like to choose one column layout. I really like that. That's just, you know, personal preference, whatever. Then I'm going to take my hierarchy and put it on the same sort of tab page here as the inspector. But then I'm going to take the inspector and just attach it to the bottom of that pane, like so. And I don't know, for me, I really enjoy this sort of layout, especially widescreen. Sometimes what I can do is I can take the game view and do this. That way I can have the scene and the game side by side, or maybe even the other way around. For the start of things, we'll go ahead and leave it as is, and it gives me a nice big console as well. So that's my personal preference for a setup, but you know, experiment, figure out what you like to do the best. All right, so in this first episode, we have set up our initial project. B, we're gonna bring in some basic graphics over here. Now, you can draw your art in Paint, in Paint.net, which is a different piece of software altogether, or even something like Photoshop or the GIMP or whatever you want. You can use basically anything you want. Generally speaking, you're going to want to save your project or your files as a transparent PNG. Now, since I can't art, I went to Open Game Art, which is a website that provides a lot of free art with really liberal licenses that you can generally use in your own games. And I've gone and picked up a sprite sheet of sci-fi sort of spaceships right over here, and oh, it doesn't actually have his name on this sheet. This is from Kenny or Keeney, KENNEY.NL, and it's licensed under Creative Commons 0. There's literally, I don't have to give him credit, I don't have to pay him, I don't have to do anything, but it seems like a nice thing to at least mention his name. So there'll be links down below to Open Game Art and to this sprite sheet if you want to use it. So it's got a bunch of little spaceship bits and things like that, and various sprites that we can use for our own purposes. So that looks pretty great. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to drag that in to my project over here. Now, because I set up my project with 2D defaults, this file here, this is an image, was brought in as a sprite. Now, if you had it set to 3D, it would have brought it in as a texture by default. So just make sure it's set to a sprite. Oops, I keep clicking off of it accidentally. Now, this is not a single sprite. Technically, we could bring in an image that would just be a single, you know, just one spaceship by itself in one image file, and that would be fine, in which case that would be a single sprite. But that's not what we have here. What we have are multiple sprites in one image. And by going to multiple here, actually, I was about to lie to you. By going to multiple here, I was going to say the Sprite Editor button shows up. The Sprite Editor button would be there anyway, but what we need to do is go to the Sprite Editor page. So if we click on that, it brings up this interface. And I'll try to embiggen this a little bit so you guys can see a little bit better. You can navigate this interface very much like the scene view. You can zoom in and out with the mouse, and with your middle mouse button held down, you can pan around. So what we have here are all our sprite graphics that have been brought in. Now, it's got this sort of checkered background to show all the transparent bits, which is exactly what we want. And we're going to pick one of these spaceships to start off with as the player ship. We might want to think about like some amount of color coding. What color should the player be? Green? Blue? Part of me wants to use this triangle shaped one because it's very kind of retro to like asteroids. And then maybe for our enemies, we can use these guys over here because they look like TIE fighters. Something like that. I'll pick something relatively, it doesn't really matter which one you pick. Oh, tell you what, we're going to grab this one over here because it kind of looks like an X-Wing, you know, or maybe like the predecessor to the X-Wing, the Z whatever headhunters. I don't know. Anyway, we've got the sprite sheet. So now what we have to do is tell Unity what represents a single sprite in this image. And the way we're going to do that is by, well, there's a couple of different ways. There's a few tools. In the top left corner over here, we could tell Unity to try automatic splicing. And what it would do is it would do its best shot at trying to figure out what each sprite is. Like what area on your graphic is an actual sprite. That won't really work too well, I think, here because it's very packed in tight. We can try it. We can tell it to slice. Nah, you can see here each one of these squares like, yeah, all right, that's correct. That's a spaceship, but this, that's not a sprite. No, none of that makes any sense. So let's go ahead and not do that. I guess revert. There we go. We'll revert to undo everything. I was trying to box select all the sprites to delete them. So the other thing is if you had everything on a really well-defined grid, you could use grid to do it, but we clearly don't here. So what we're going to do is we're going to manually define some of these sprites. We're going to start off with our little X-wingy type thing. So this is going to be our player ship. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a square around the player ship that totally encompasses it. You can see here the edges. Yep. We've got every little pixel, there's no runoff, everything is good. When I tend to make sprite sheets, I usually pad things out a little bit. I think this was probably put together by a computer program that combined all the sprites together. I'm actually curious, if I take a look at the space shooter thing. Okay. I could have, you can see here, so if I look at the space shooter, I went to the sprite sheet, but there's also the option of just using the individual ship graphics, which may or may not make things easier. The advantage of the sprite sheet is then Unity only has to worry about one image file and load that into your video card memory. So it actually optimizes a lot of things. Now Unity can sort of create its own sprite sheets or sprite atlases based on individual sprites, but anyway, way too complicated for this tutorial. So we've drawn a box around our player ship. So we've defined our player sprite. You can see the information in the bottom right corner. It's got the position and the size. It's got 99 pixels wide, 75 pixels high. The pivot is set to center. What is the pivot? Well, you can see this little circly bit here. We're basically, if we were to rotate this graphic, what point do we want to rotate the graphic around? Now, in our situation here, I definitely think the center is probably right. If the player wants to rotate his ship, it should probably rotate around the middle. On the other hand, I gotta say, there's something to be said about probably the center of mass looks more like around here. You know, if we were to rotate this ship, maybe it should rotate kind of around this point. You feel what I'm saying? Like, it feels a little bit more like center of mass because the nose is going to be a little lighter. So tell you what, let's go ahead and use the custom pivot point, which honestly I have never used before in my life. And we're going to just drop the Y to maybe a 0.3, no, 3.5. Does that look right to you? It feels right to me. So we're going to do that. So now when we drop this image in the game, and we'll see it in just a second, it'll rotate around this point. And I think that'll feel pretty good. You notice this trim button as well. If we had drawn a box that was too big and it had a lot of extra like blank space, we could hit trim to automatically bring it down. Last thing we're going to do is name this sprite. We're going to name it to player ship sprite, or just player ship should be fine. Something like that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and apply these changes. So right now we've only defined the one sprite. We'll come back and get some enemies later on, and then we can close this window. Now, what we've done, in our project view, you can see our sheet over here, but it's got the little expando triangle. We can click on that and load up, and you can see there's a sprite in here called the player ship. As we define more sprites in our sprite sheet, more and more things will drop down over here. So let me go ahead and drop this into our scene. Then Let's see what happens when we rotate. I'm curious to see if this worked exactly the way I was expecting. Now, what axis do you rotate it around? What axis? The answer is the z-axis. In our 2D view, our plane is x this way, y this way. The z-axis goes directly like through the top of this thing out the other scene. It becomes very obvious if we drop out of 2D mode. You can see very clearly the z-axis is your blue line here, and you can see the z-axis extends through the camera into and out the other side of the graphic. So if we want to rotate our ship around, we're rotating around the z-axis. But if we want to move around, you can see quite clearly as we move around here, it is the x and y that is changing. So let's go ahead and do a little bit of rotation. Yeah, see, you can see it's rotating around that point. It becomes really obvious if we put it sort of on one of these grid markers, right at that little circle. It becomes really obvious that it rotates around that point. I think that feels good. But, you know, depending on your graphic and personal preferences and whatever, different things will work. Okay, so this is sprite number 1. Let's go ahead and define another couple of sprites while we're at it. So let's go back to the sprite sheet. Let's go ahead and click on our Sprite Editor. And then let's, I don't know, little laser beams and ships. Yeah, okay, let's figure out an alien ship. So we're red. Let's make the alien ship nice and gray, kind of TIE fighter-y. You know, I'm really, yeah, I'm digging that. So I'm going to just try to drag it in such a way that we've got this graphic by itself. And actually, I can probably show off the trim function here. If I click this and then click trim. There, did you see what happened right over here? I had a little bit of an extra pixel here that was just empty. If you hit trim, it'll automatically tighten up your box so that it looks right. I'm going to say that the center pivot is going to be perfectly fine for this guy here, and that's going to be good. So I'm going to call this enemy 01. Okay, just the graphic for one of our enemies. And that's pretty good. And then while we're at it, you can see our old sprite is still there. We've got a box on our player ship. And while we're at it, let's grab some sort of bullet here. Do we want a line, like a little bit of a laser beam line? Yeah, I think that feels pretty good. Maybe this blue one. We can use this as a player shot, and then we can figure out what we want the enemies to shoot later on. So it looks like we do there. It's just in the graphics I'm using, it does fade right to the bottom over here, so I'm going to make sure to include that in the box. And this one here is going to be, I don't know, beam? Bullet? Bullet 1. Okay. So everything should, we've got enemy 01, bullet. I guess I could use the same sort of nomenclature over here. 01, player ship. Okay, we're going to apply these. And now if we close our editor, you can see here in our sprite sheet, we've got all the other sprites. I can drop them into the game world and see everything there. Now, what I'm going to do, speaking of the game world, I'm going to go ahead and bring the scene view over to the right. So remember, this over here is the scene view, and this over here is the game view. And actually, I just noticed something. I noticed a couple of things. First of all, I brought in a second player ship instead of a bullet. Next, the second thing is the player ship is actually bringing in some graphics that it really should not be. You see this edging? I think that our sprite sheet might be a little too squooshed. What are we picking up? Just a little bit. Oh, no. Okay. This line is drawn correctly, but it's almost like the tip of this wing. This is sort of the destroyed version of a ship. Does it feel like it might be weirdly overflowing and getting clipped there? What's going on? What's going on is this filter mode. Probably. We're going to find out. I'm going to change it, and hopefully I'm not lying to you. What if I go to point mode? Yes! You see that? So what's going on? And clearly the graphics are kind of on the fuzzy side here. Well, normally in a texture in a 3D game in Unity, you quite want bilinear or trilinear filtering. It sort of smooths out your textures, especially good if you're looking at a wall sort of on the diagonal or it's a little further away. The bilinear filter modes helps blend your pixels together and makes things look a lot better. However, in a 2D game where you're relying on pixel perfect precision, especially with splitting up your sprite sheets, usually you don't want that. Usually you don't want any blending. You don't want the 3D engine to try to be smart with your textures. You say, I want to use the pixels exactly as is with no sort of blending. It's like, okay, now that's looking a little bit better. So we're going to go ahead and apply that. And there we go. So you can see there's no weird fuzziness. Everything seems to be okay there, which is great. You get a little bit more of a pixely effect, but in a 2D game, that's often not bad. Stylistically, that can work. If you still have a bit of a problem with that, the other thing you can do is change your format here from compressed to, say, like 16-bit color. That makes another little bit of a difference. Or true color. True color might be even better. in this case, it does have an effect. So the difference between the two is here, this image will be 4 megs when you ship your game online. This version with the 16-bit will be 2 megs, and the compressed version will be 1 meg, much, much smaller. But it's a little bit lossy, so you're losing a little bit of the quality of the image when you compress it, depending on various little factors. The max size could also be a thing. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 4K. Now, my graphic is not that big. My image is actually a 1K image. You can see down here, 1024 by 1024. But if your sprite sheet was any bigger than that, you'll want to change the max size to match. In this case, the fact that I set it here has no impact whatsoever because it's only this big, so it won't. It's not going to get expanded up to 4K. It's just not going to get shrunk. Whereas if I moved it to 256 and applied that, now it would be shrinking the image quality in our released product. And this sort of thing can really work for, well, this is a little bit small, for mobile games and things like that, where you might want to set different things. We'll go ahead and put it back to 1024, which is its actual size. But again, as long as it's at least the actual size or bigger, it's fine. It's not going to make the image any bigger in your final product. It's just, you know, not shrinking it. All right, I'm going to say that looks relatively good. So we've got our graphics in the game. You can see here in the game view, they're not actually centered. And why is that? Well, of course, the center of the game view is where the camera is. The camera, if we check, is at position 0, 0, minus 10. The minus 10 is important. Now, because we are in an orthographic view, so what's the difference between orthographic and a projection view, which is normal? Let's go into the top view over here in 3D mode. All right. So this box represents the area that is viewed by the camera. In a 3D game, you would usually be in perspective mode because a camera sort of lenses out like that and gets bigger. Things in the distance look smaller. In orthographic projection, they don't. Everything is always the same size. In a 2D game, this is usually the sort of effect you want. Furthermore, the advantage of it makes it really predictable how tall the screen is. And what do I mean by that? Well, the orthographic size over here, which is the size of 5, says that from the top of the screen to the bottom of, or rather, sorry, from the middle of the screen to the top of the screen, that is 5 Unity units tall. And vice versa, from the middle to the bottom, that is another 5. So in other words, our screen is 10 units tall from top to bottom. Now the width, we can't really answer that right now because of course it depends on the size of the window. But notice that no matter what I do to the window here, it doesn't change the height. If I change this, you'll actually see the graphics shrink. And that's because here, it's still 10 units from top to bottom. And here, it's 10 units from top to bottom. So everything visually gets shrunk or stretched to match that. But the width doesn't happen. It's just like, it doesn't change the size of your graphics. It's just like, okay, now you have more room to play with. If you want more room to play with vertically, what you can do is you can change the projection. I can change this to say 10. We'll see everything shrink because now it's 20 units from top to bottom. These ships are probably about 1 unit tall. So as your camera sees more game units, your ships will be that much smaller. Or if I shrink and bring down the size to, say, 2, now the stuff is huge, okay? So that relationship is there. You can have another impact on this in your graphics, and here's the thing. Our sprite sheet here, we're just using a single sprite sheet, which makes life a little simpler, but sometimes you might have a few different image files. And it turns out you drew one ship really big and another ship really small, but in the game world, you want them both to be the same size. Or you drew them the same size, but you realize something's supposed to be bigger or smaller or whatever. This pixels to unit here determines in your image, right, in your image over here, 1 pixel. How many Unity units does that translate to? Or actually, it's the other way around. 1 unit in the Unity world space is going to be how many pixels for our 2D rendering. This is not something you usually have to worry about in 3D stuff, but in 2D it matters. So let's say we change it. So right now it takes 100 pixels to make 1 unit. Well, if we drop it to 50, everything will become twice as big as soon as we apply it. Boom. And that's because it only takes 50 pixels now to equal 1 unit in the Unity world. So we'll leave it at 100. I think that's actually a really, really good number for what we've got based on the vertical space. So based on a orthographic projection of 5, this size looks pretty good. Maybe we'll tune it later. Maybe we'll decide we're going to zoom out the camera a little bit. Maybe we'll decide to zoom it in. We'll figure it out as we go. It depends on your game, of course, and what exactly you're trying to do. If it's a game that where you are kind of boxed in just the screen, very much like an asteroid style game, then you actually might want your ship graphics and everything to be a little bit smaller so you have a bit more room. But if it's the sort of thing where the screen scrolls with you and you've got a lot of space to work with, then you can afford to have the spaceship graphics maybe be a little bit bigger. It really is going to come down a lot to the style of game you have. Also, how fast your ship moves around. Because the faster your sort of ship moves relative to the world, usually the more kind of zoomed out you have to be able to give the players enough vision so they don't just smash into something. So, yeah, a few little things you can play with there. What else did I want to look at in this particular episode? We did 2D graphics, orthographic projection, or importing graphics, defining sprites, and the project setup. Okay, well, we are there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and clear out the, I'm going to remove the enemy and the bullet from our scene. Oh, I'll go back into 2D view, zoom in, and yeah, I'll just remove the bullet and the enemy from our scene, and I'm going to go ahead and center the player ship. I'm going to just put its position to 0, 0, which will be in the middle of our game screen because it'll be aligned with our camera. Oh, that was the other thing I wanted to mention, why the Z-axis on the camera is important. If I set the Z-axis on the camera to 0, we don't see anything. In fact, even if I go to 0.2, we still don't see anything. If I go to 0.3, nothing, but 0.31, oops, and I hit enter. Oh, sorry. Negative 0.31. So that's, I'm still not lying. If I go to 0.1, nothing. 0.2, nothing. 0.3, nothing. 0.31 in the negative axis, all of a sudden we can see things. Why is that? Our camera has a clipping plane, our near clipping plane. Anything that is closer to the camera than this will not show up on the screen. So that's why we just set it to some number. Because it's orthographic, the distance doesn't actually matter. Things, if we're 100 units away, doesn't make our ship look any smaller because it's the orthographic projection. The only thing that matters is if we go beyond our far clipping plane. So if we go to 1005, now everything will disappear. And again, if we go to 0, then nothing happens. So 10 is a fine number. Just if you, for some reason, you can't see anything in the game screen, check your transform over here, and also make sure your camera is in the right position because maybe you forgot to put in the negative. So now your camera is over here and you're like, why can't I see everything? Well, that's because your graphic is here, your camera is here and pointing that way. So we're going to go ahead and just back that up. All right, we're going to bring this to a wrap. In the next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to have the player move around a little bit, and we're going to talk about how the camera might work in relation to your player. So yeah, that'll be it. It'll be pretty easy. It'll be fun to have our little guy drive around. See you next time, folks. Bye-bye.